the emphasis on the group and its outcome,
Mhm.
as opposed to the individual and his or her potential. Seems to me, it's the shift from equality to equity is the same shift from intent to impact. And I wanted to get to that because everything is viewed from the level of systems and harm and oppression between these various groups. And so, for example, we have now told this week by the New York Times, by Dean Beckett, that what matters in using various words that could be understood in some contexts to be, in many contexts, to be racially inflammatory, that your intent in using that word is irrelevant. So
Right.
when I don't know what really happened in the Donald McNeil case, so I'm not casting judgment or I can't make a decision about that. But what I can say is that if you are describing a word, the N word, as it's been used, describing whether, as I understand he was, whether one kind of utterance of it needs to be punished or another kind of utterance is okay, how much punishment should be meted out to this person and so on. And for him to just say that word as a way to discuss that issue is, at this point, no better than if he screamed it at an African-American student in a fit of abuse. And that is so your intent as an individual what matters is the result. If someone was harmed, that's what matters. And how do you know if someone was harmed? They simply say they were. No other proof is required. Now that's coming from the Times. I mean, that is, again, we look at that institution a bit too often, but I do think it represents to some extent the Vatican of the cathedral, as it were, of acceptable liberal discourse, and to shift from the fact that a writers, speakers, their intent in using language is now irrelevant, is an incredible attack upon the freedom to write, to think, and liberalism altogether.
Yeah. No, I think there's so much going on with that story. I mean, I think the fact that the New York Times sort of official response to this controversy began with, well, he didn't mean it in a derogatory way. We ought to give him an opportunity to learn, i.e. intent matters. Days later, another statement, intent doesn't matter. You don't get to use these words. And I think for precisely the same reason that you just suggested, we focus on the New York Times a lot because it is a bit of a bellwether and gives us some sensibility about what's going on. That kind of whiplash, that sort of shift in thinking from, moments ago, days ago, you were saying that this was okay, and now it isn't suddenly, I think is very much indicative of where we find ourselves and where the real problems are. And it's imperative for folks to focus on the reality that policing language in this way, insisting that we disregard intent and simply set up, essentially this trap for people, because even to use, N word in quotes is potentially dangerous for you. This is about something other than, well, actually, it's very much about privilege and it's very much about power, but not in the way that people imagine. This isn't about protecting Black people so much as wielding power and perhaps prescribing for people what is acceptable to say and not say. And maybe it has something to do with institutions that, feel uniquely vulnerable now because they don't have the sort of monopoly that they used to have in terms of, what is acceptable to talk about openly, or who the authorities are in our society.
But I think
that may have something to do with it. But the specific issues with respect to race are, I think, very interesting too.
What seemed to have happened here is that Black staffers got on Beckett's case about this. That once they discovered that they had done an investigation, figured out what happened, told him that you shouldn't do that in future, but he didn't mean any racist intent. Somehow, other staffers at the newspaper managed to pressure through also an online media campaign to get this guy
Uh-huh.
finished, and to have that be
Yeah.
basically the entire point of his career in some ways. He had been a celebrated reporter on the COVID crisis, for example. He was regarded as a pretty good journalist.
Yeah.
Which means essentially that a group that maybe this is the way that Slack works now, or maybe it's the way the internet works, or that Twitter works, is that online mobs, essentially now make the big decisions for the New York Times editorial. That's what's happening.
Yeah.
And one also has to wonder, who were these kids that were so traumatized by this? I mean, they're obviously kids whose parents can afford like $6,000 to send them on a tour of Peru. It's not clear that he's engaging in anything, or it might even be clear they were trying to trap him, because they also know the power they have now.
Well, even the folks who work at the Times, who were so deeply offended that this took place, I mean, they apparently imagine themselves as victims, as sort of systematically disadvantaged and and unheard within the New York Times, when all available evidence suggests, in many respects, they are the people responsible for running the newsroom.
Yeah.
Simultaneously suggesting that they are disadvantaged and disempowered, and that no one listens to them or cares about them, while at the same time being the driving force behind this profound cultural shift, these purges that are being inspired by the work that they're doing. Even over the summer, when we were seeing, this massive tumult that was taking place in the country, these demonstrations that would occasionally give way to paroxysms of violence and looting and burning. You had someone like Nicole Hannah-Jones at the New York Times saying that it would be, her honor to have these described as 1619 riots, which, I mean, there's something very obscene about the way that invocations of race and talk of white privilege and white supremacy kind of flatten the actual complexity of the world, but also in the way that they take Blackness, this thing, and they conflate the experience and the life experience, the lived experience of someone, who's a prominent New York Times reporter or contributor, or editor in chief, with the lived experience of someone who lives on the South Side of Chicago and who lives like this genuinely difficult life, regardless of the race that they happen to be. And who wins in that exchange? When we're pretending that Nicole Hannah-Jones is sort of disadvantaged in some way, shape, or form that is fundamentally the same as someone who lives in the South Side of Chicago or in East New York, or someplace in rural America, and is just deprived, that their experiences are the same because of their Blackness in some fundamental sense. I think that sort of distortion of reality is one that probably hurts the people who need help the most, while giving a tremendous amount of power and ostensible moral authority to people who already have a great deal of power